Hello, John here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to discuss travel photography and some tips and lessons that I learned when I was recently in Portugal. So, a few months back, I sat down with my boss and I asked him if I could work remotely from my laptop. I've been thinking I wanted to do some international travel for a while, and I was definitely sick of being in the office every day. And he agreed. So I packed my backpack and packed up my little LX100, and I hit the road to Europe, actually. And this was the first time that I had gone somewhere internationally with my camera with the express purpose of, capturing some photographs of a country that I had never been to before. And so I thought I would share some of the lessons I learned from my time in Portugal, where I spent the most time. I was there almost a month. And hopefully, as you're watching this, you can learn something from my experiences, from my mistakes, and from the images that I captured. So let's just get right into it. So the first lesson I think I want to impart to you is don't be afraid to wander. And this opening photograph is really, I guess, exemplary of that. It's just a random alleyway that I wandered down, and there's not anything particularly special about this image. But a lot of times when you travel, you'll end up on tours or with groups of people. You'll join up with people from a hostel or a hotel. You'll meet people on the road, and you'll end up spending a lot of time with other human beings, enjoying a new and exciting place. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. But I would encourage you also to wander alone, to wander on your own with your camera. Because the reality is that your party is not going to want to wait around while you go down some alleyway to capture the light the way that it's shining off of this particular building. And that's more or less what happened here. Luckily, I was alone, so I could stand here for as long as I wanted. Another thing that wandering around by yourself affords you is that you can come across a scene like this and capture it from a bunch of different angles. When you're with other people, what often happens is they want to kind of take everything in, take a few quick snapshots, and then move on, basically. But I spent the better part of, I think, half an hour here at this particular spot because I just loved the way that these buildings looked. I loved the way that the colors from the vines and the foliage on this wall were sort of mirroring what I was seeing in the buildings to the right. I thought that was really cool. And I took a bunch of different images of this location. I think my favorite one ended up being when I got to the top of that wall and sort of used the edge there as a leading line to sort of bring your eye into the architecture. And that's the kind of stuff that just happens as you basically just lace up your shoes and start walking around a new place for a few hours by yourself. This is in a neighborhood, I believe, called the Alfama district. I'm probably mispronouncing that. If you're Portuguese, I apologize. But it was a beautiful place, and I loved the buildings there, and I spent, the better part of a day wandering around. I might have even gone there multiple times to just check out the buildings and enjoy the surroundings. On that same walk, I came across this beautiful, I think it was a church. And you basically come to this sort of outcropping, and it looked out over the river there. There were ships in the river, and this beautiful building was sitting here. And I was noticing a lot of tourists were sort of just coming up, taking a snapshot, and walking away. The thing is, on this particular day, the light was changing quite a bit, because as you can see, it was partly cloudy. So the clouds would come over the sun, and then they would leave again, and everything would change. The lighting would change as that was going on. And so the next sort of tip or lesson I think I would leave you with is don't be afraid to stand around and wait for the light to change. In this instance, I sort of lined up this shot and I took it just to compose it and see sort of what I thought of the whole thing. But then I noticed over a little bit of time that the clouds would move and the light would hit this building a little bit differently. And that it was sort of accentuating, I think, the interesting parts of this church. And while I watched 6 or 7 people come up, take a quick photo with their phone of this building, and some of them even with, more expensive cameras, I thought to myself, gosh, I could see that the clouds were moving. If you just wait a little bit longer, the shot was going to get so much better. So I took another frame, this time without the trees sort of as on the edges, and I think that cleaned the image up a lot, and I was much happier with that composition. And the light was beginning to move in a direction that I thought was interesting, and getting closer towards the image that I was seeing in my mind. And then finally it actually happened, and this is the edited version, obviously. But the sun came out, it just blasted the side of this thing, and casted some really nice shadows and contrast. And I was really happy with the result ultimately. I think it was one of the better shots that I took of the trip. All it required of me was enough patience to, stand around for 20 minutes. This is an instance where basically that didn't work. So I stood on this sidewalk watching this road, really hoping that an interesting vehicle of some kind would come down, or maybe some people walking, and I would be able to capture them as the subject, and then there would be this nice leading lines to this termination point where the arch is there, kind of in the center of the frame. But it just didn't pan out. So sometimes you're going to stand around for 20 minutes and nothing's going to happen. That's just kind of, part of the deal. So another thing that I learned that I think is worth pointing out is that just because you're traveling, just because you're in an exotic destination, someplace that you've never been before, where the food is interesting and maybe you don't know what people are saying most of the time around you, doesn't mean that every image you take has to exemplify that. In this instance, I was just walking down the street and I saw that the clouds sort of mirrored the same silhouette that the trees were forming. And I thought that was interesting. It caught my eye. And so I took a quick snapshot of it. It's not a particularly special photo, but it's just another memoir from the trip. And even though it could be in Portugal or France or, Africa, it's still an image that I like, and I think it was worth taking. So whenever you're in a new place, there's often something that is going to grab your eye immediately. And in Lisbon, the thing that really struck me as remarkable is the buildings and the architecture. There's all of these beautiful, beautiful roofs that are sort of this brownish gold color, and the way the sun catches them is always sort of striking and interesting. If I remember this correctly, I believe there was an earthquake in the city sometime in the 1700s, and it basically leveled everything. And so they rebuilt the entire city at that point, and so there's this real sense of continuity in the architecture and the housing and all of the office buildings there, at least in kind of the old town. And I really enjoyed that, because as you would take images, you wouldn't be distracted by these, drastically different sort of forms. Everything sort of is cohesive and works together. And so I captured that a lot when I was there. This is another example of me seeing something that I really liked, but not being able to make a photo out of it. So I love this beautiful blue building. It's just really cool. And I really wanted someone to walk basically from behind me into my frame so that I could capture them as sort of the subject, and they would be entering this really neat scene. Unfortunately, a guy in a fancy suit or a woman in a dress never really came by. And so I never really got the photograph that I wanted here. And you have to accept that sometimes that's just going to happen. So we've touched on this a little bit already, but I think it's worth reiterating. And that is that you have to wait for the right shot. And sometimes, like we talked about earlier, that's waiting for light. But in this case, I'm waiting for a trolley. So there's these really cool sort of old trolleys that are still serving as public transportation in Lisbon. And I love the way this road sort of curved around the corner, and these buildings even are built on a curve, and everything is sort of moving off into this specific point in the frame. And I wanted to capture a trolley there, but of course I don't want this blue truck in the way. And so I stood in this corner using an electrical box as my tripod for the better part of, I think, about half an hour, waiting to get to the point where I actually could capture the trolley where I wanted it in the frame without any distracting elements. And it's true that I could probably take a couple of different frames and then merge them in Photoshop and get rid of the extra cars. But I don't do a lot in Photoshop. It's not really my preference. I kind of like to just capture stuff in camera and, throw my own preset on it in Lightroom and be done with it. That's kind of my style. And so I took a couple shots trying to get the right thing, and eventually I finally landed the one that made me happy. This one still isn't perfect. There's actually a little corner of this van that you can see on the front edge of the trolley. But that, I can live with that. It's not the end of the world. I think overall it works as an image, and it was sort of the thing that I was trying to create as I was standing there. And honestly, it just took a lot of patience. That's sort of the name of the game when it comes to this kind of stuff. So going back to some of the architecture that we talked about earlier, not every photograph that you take on your travels has to be your best work. This is an example of just kind of the area. I was up on this particular evening. I had gone out to go and see the castle that's sort of on a hill that sits sort of above the river there. And I was wandering the ramparts, and it was a beautiful, nice, warm evening. It had been quite rainy before. And I was just noticing the light catching all of these buildings, and I sort of love the surroundings anyway. And so I took this image. And I think you have to keep in mind while you're traveling that even if the compositions aren't perfect or there's no super strong subject, these are still your memories that you're capturing. And sometimes it's worth it to just take photos of things you think are beautiful, even if they're not images that maybe you would share on social media or print on your wall or anything like that. This is another example of sort of that same concept. I actually didn't like this image when I took it. I didn't like it when I edited it later when I got back to the hotel I was staying at. And it wasn't until I was sort of preparing for this video that I sort of decided, no, this is actually an image I appreciate. It's just a flag on top of this castle, but it sort of reminds me of my experiences there that evening. And I like that it's very simple and very plain. So you have to remember that when you're traveling, this is a place that you may never be again for the rest of your life. And so it pays to take that extra photo. Every time you think to yourself, I could go over there and take this shot of this thing. It's a lot of work, or it's too far. I was just over there. Do it. Just go and do it, because you're not gonna, in all likelihood, get the chance to take that shot again. It's not like your hometown where you can just, visit the same scene over and over in different lighting conditions. Another thing I think is worth doing is take panorama shots. I do a lot of stitching of photos together. I'll take 2 or 3 frames and then stitch them into a panorama. And especially for travel photography, it really gives you a sense of a location. And that's sort of what I like to go back and remember about the places that I visit is, what did it look like and feel like when I was there? And it's so easy now in Lightroom. You can just select the photos and, it'll throw them together for you really quickly. It's a really simple technique. It allows for high resolution images, and I think they look really cool. So we're getting towards the end of my sort of tips here. I took a trip when I was there to a place called Sintra, and Sintra has this gorgeous castle that is just a fairy tale beautiful. You can't even believe it when you're there. The colors are vibrant, the architecture is interesting. But while I was there, even on this whole trip, actually, I was sort of at a strange point in my life where I couldn't decide if I wanted to move back to where I left. I packed up all of the things that I owned and put them in storage and basically left California to take this trip. And I didn't know if I would be traveling for a month or 2 years. I really had no idea. And that sounds very romantic and exciting, and of course it was. But there are also moments where I was lonely and uncertain about my future and where I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And I think as we've looked through these images, and especially these images of Sintra, there's not a lot of people in them. They're sort of lonely photos. And so I think there's oftentimes an expectation when we're traveling that every moment should be awesome and amazing and exciting, and you should never have a down moment. But the reality is that, especially if you're traveling long term, there are going to be rainy days and sad days and frustrating days and days where maybe you miss your friends. A lot of times on previous trips I've taken, I'd sort of sync up with a group of people. We'd sort of hit it off and then go have adventures together. But in all of my travels this time around, that never really happened. And so at this point in my journey, I was just kind of feeling bummed out. And so I would encourage you to just capture not only where you are, but what you are. And I sort of did that here without doing it intentionally. It just kind of happened, I guess. But there's no shame in that. And I think it makes your photographs of your experience more authentic. The fact that there aren't many people in these photos doesn't hurt, because the location is just kind of amazing. Now, this is an example where I sort of went too far with that idea. I was actually trying to get these people out of my photo. I was waiting for them to walk all the way through my frame so I could capture this tunnel and then these archways here at the end. But this would have been a perfect opportunity if I had backed up to basically take a photograph where this couple holding hands was walking through this tunnel into this amazing location. Well, I don't know what I was thinking. This would have been a really good shot, or I think it would have been. But I don't know, I was not in that frame of mind. And so maybe the lesson here is to get out of your shell a little bit, get out of your head a little bit, and make sure you're watching what's happening around you. And maybe don't let the way you're feeling cause you to miss an otherwise really great opportunity. That's sort of what happened here. So I think I'll leave you with this. When you're traveling to new locations, when you're seeing other parts of the world, or even your own country, or even your own city, oftentimes you'll get sort of a certain sense, a certain feeling. A place will have a specific vibe. And Sintra specifically, like I said earlier, just had this kind of magical fairy tale kind of feeling. And so as I was leaving, I noticed that I was looking at the castle kind of through these trees as you're walking down the path to exit. And it just sort of felt like this forbidden castle, this maybe where mystical people or strange creatures might live. And so I took the shot sort of through these trees as if it was a place that you kind of couldn't get to, that you couldn't access. And in this particular instance, I feel like that really captures sort of the way that Sintra felt, and at least the way that it felt to me. And I think whenever I go somewhere, that's always kind of my endeavor. That's always kind of my goal, is to authentically represent my own experience of a new place. So I guess I'll leave you with that. And I would encourage you, if you haven't traveled anywhere in a while, take some time off. If you can afford it, go buy a plane ticket or save up for a few years and get yourself ready and go see someplace new. And when you go, don't forget to bring your camera.